Welcome Rogue Engineers to this tutorial. This is part of the Space Fighter series and covers how to create a multiplayer space duel game that runs in a browser. Before going through this tutorial, please make sure you've checked out the intro video and also the starter tutorials and docs for Rogue Engine. When writing a multiplayer network game, it's actually quite important to plan for the multiplayer aspect at the start. It's much more difficult to put a multiplayer system into your code at the end of development. In fact, it's probably almost impossible. Now, Rogue Engine has a package available for it called Rogue Croquet. Once you've made your new project, download that package to your project. Create a new scene and add the Croquet config component to your scene object and fill in the app name field. Save your scene with a suitable name to the assets directory or a scenes directory if you prefer. Now let's make a player prefab. This is going to be used for each player. We can start by removing the default cube from the scene and making a new object 3D. I would rename it to something like SF Player or something similar. And then we add our player model to it. You can use your own model if you like, or use our Space Fighter model. Import the GLB model and add it to the player object that we just made. Once you have a player model, make a new directory called prefabs and drag the whole SF player object down into that directory. That will create a new prefab. Next, we need to make a new game component to handle the communication between players. Make a folder called components and then add a subfolder called Croquet, just to be tidy. Then create a new component called Game. Open your game component in your code editor, whichever one you prefer to use, and set up the following imports. Then add a Rogue Croquet model that keeps track of all the player actors. Instead of the regular RE component class, we replace it with a Croquet View class to create our players from our player prefab. This Croquet View interconnects with our game model. Add your game component that you've just created to the scene object, and we can see that the game component requires a player prefab. Drag your player prefab into this field. One last thing you need for the Croquet system is a croquet.json file in your static directory. You can find out how to configure this from the Rogue Croquet GitHub page. Next, we need to create a component to control the players in the game. Each player in the game will run this component and will be attached to the player prefab we created before. First, let's make a new component in the components directory called Network Player. Now add the following imports to allow us to make a Croquet actor and pawn. Instead of the usual RE component class, replace this with a Rogue Croquet.model class, which extends the actor class, and register the network player component extending the Croquet pawn class. The model part of this component describes the data that is communicated about the player by Croquet to other players, so we need to have some values like the position, rotation and the player number defined here. In the update function, we just allocate a player number if that's not happened yet. Now in the Croquet pawn class, we can define all the properties the players on the screen will need. We need to define a camera location, a prefab for lasers, a list of spawn points for players to start at, laser turret positions, and an explosion prefab for when the players hit. Then we define a few variables to keep track of things in the player and define our network player properties that link with the network model. When the component runs for the first time, we initialize by checking if the model belongs to the current player, and if not, just move the object 3D to the transform position set. If it is the current player, attach the camera to the dolly, which is the player viewpoint, and define the object as a possible target. Now the bit that does all the heavy lifting, the update function. Here we get input from the player, set flags for engine status, set players to their spawn point, fire lasers, and check if the player's been hit and is in the process of being destroyed. The get input function that is called from the update function reads mouse, keyboard and gamepad input to set the movement of the spaceship and fire lasers. The final function is create laser fire, That creates 2 laser bolts from prefabs which then move themselves. When this is done, add your network player component to the player prefab. Now let's set up our player ship. The network player requires several properties to be supplied. The pawn prefab is a reference to the player prefab. The camera is the main scene camera, which will become the player view. We need to make an object inside the prefab to attach the camera to, called the dolly, and set a reference in that field. We need to provide a prefab for the laser, which will be fired, and an explosion prefab for when the ship is hit. 2 turrets need to be defined so that we know where the lasers start from. We can make them like we did the dolly and put a reference in those fields. And finally, we need some spawn points for the players. We'll define 2 here and set them in that list. Now we have the player ship set, we can update that by dragging it back into the prefab directory. We can add other items to our scene like planets or a skybox by supplying a starfield cube map and make our spawn points into space stations. When this is done, we have a basic multiplayer spaceship duel. This tutorial is just part of the TechnoVisual Space project. Follow this channel for more game making tips. If you want to follow how the whole game is being made and even get access to some of the source code and assets, become a TechnoVisual Space patron. See the link in the description.